Fast Forward Productions. The women are speaking.
I always view the garden as the great connector, and that whole idea of creating beneficial relationships between plants and animals and people. And that's what we need to cultivate more. Pardon the pun. We need to cultivate more in our lives.
You're listening to the Good Dirt Podcast. This is a place where we dig into the nitty-gritty of sustainable living through food, fashion, and lifestyle.
And we're your hosts, Mary and Emma Kingsley, the mother and daughter founder team of Lady Farmer. We're sowing seeds of slow living through our community platform, events, and online marketplace.
We started this podcast as a means to share the wealth of information and quality conversations that we're having in our world as we dream up and deliver ways for each of us to live into the new paradigm, one that is regenerative, balanced, and whole.
We want to put the microphone in front of the voices that need to be heard the most right now. The farmers, the dreamers, the designers, and the doers.
So come cultivate a better world with us. We're so glad you're here. Now, let's dig in.
Emma, good morning.
Good morning. We're getting into summer now, and I'm wondering how you had so many fun experiments with the garden at the beginning of this spring. You were starting seeds, you were doing this low waste gardening thing, and I just wonder what that was like for you, especially in the beginning, getting it all going and how you were feeling about it.
Well, what's happening now is that I have really tried to not buy plants, not go to the garden center to get a bunch of stuff. Because when you go there, just to give a little background for someone who might not have heard this, I realized that every spring when I would go to the garden center and be all excited about getting started with the season, I would come home with a bunch of plants and a bunch of stuff and plant them. And then I would be left with a huge, big old pile of trash, just things to throw away. Plastic containers for the plants and bags with whatever, like things for the soil, worm castings, all kinds of things that you get over there and you think, oh, this would be a good idea. So anyway, I challenged myself to resist that, and I called it my low waste garden challenge. And so we're still pretty early in the season, So I have not gone to the garden center for this big haul. I have bought a few things that I have been unable to find elsewhere or grow for myself. And I'll tell you what these two items are. One of them is stevia. I love to grow stevia in the summer, but it's very difficult to germinate. I don't know why. Maybe some of you out there can write in and tell me why I haven't been able to grow that from seed. So there's this one place in the area that sells stevia plants in the spring, and I have to go get them really, really early or else they'll sell out. So I bought that. And my strawberry patch got wiped out this year because it got invaded by mugwort.
Oh, no.
So I went and I replaced my strawberry plants. But other than that, I have been transplanting my own plants and moving them around. And I have put out a call to the neighbors and friends to come over for a plant swap. So trying to organize that. There are also plant swaps in the area that I have been to. It's just really fun to find out how much you can get without buying it in these places, the big box stores with all the stuff. And there are a lot of things in those places that you don't want in your garden. Obviously, a lot of chemicals and so forth, herbicides, pesticides.
What a fun experiment. I can't wait to keep following along and see, how it turns out. And then at the end of the season, how you're feeling about how it went. So yeah, everyone stay tuned.
Yeah, this really sort of ties into today's episode because we're talking to Kareen Erbe. She is the owner of Broken Ground, which is garden design consulting business. And she's a homesteader and an educator. And she practices and she teaches permaculture. One of the things she says in this interview is how much community is a part of permaculture. There's a community of plants. They work together. You have things that grow well together, that cooperate with each other. And so I thought that was a great tie-in to this idea of the Low Waste Garden Challenge because I'm reaching out to the community and saying, hey, if you have extra plants and I have extra plants, things that I've got plenty of, let's share. Let's share and spread the abundance of our own garden. So I thought that was a really great community tie-in with Kareen today.
Definitely. And I also love talking to Kareen and thinking about you and your garden project over there at the farm, because it has been, I guess, 12 years now. And it's really a fun thing to watch. You know, the intentions that you went in with at the beginning, from like laying down the mulch and killing off the grass in that part of the back pasture, to the way the mulch has become this gorgeous soft soil over the years, and the things that you've grown and the little areas you've created and then recreated, and the way things have changed, and the fences that have gone up and come down. And it's such a fun thing to look back on and talk about. And Kareen helps folks do this all the time. You know, she really knows her stuff. And something that I love about you, Mom, is you sort of that you don't really know your stuff. You know what you're doing, but you very much just try things and go with it. And, you know, you've never been a garden teacher or a permaculture teacher or anything. So we like talking to the experts and mixing them in with your own personal experience.
It's true. I do not claim to be an expert. I claim to be a enthusiastic experimenter. So I really enjoyed talking to Kareen, because for over a decade, she's helped thousands of people in particularly cold climates grow their own food, so that they can, you know, eat healthier and live more sustainably and become more self-reliant.
She helps people all along their process. So whether you're getting started on your first ever garden, or you're designing a full-blown homestead or a large-scale farm, she knows how to help you. She has her signature Resilient Homestead program, which she offers every single fall. She's got a thriving YouTube channel. She is certified in permaculture design, which is a whole systems approach to land management and sustainable living. And she is on the faculty of the Permaculture Women's Guild, Green Path Herb School, and the Central Rocky Mountain Permaculture Institute.
Kareen lives with her husband on a suburban homestead in Bozeman, Montana, with a greenhouse, pond, vegetable gardens, a food forest of fruit trees and berry bushes, a flock of chickens, and her dog, Benny. So hope you'll enjoy this conversation today with Kareen Erbe, owner of Broken Ground, from Bozeman, Montana.
And I own a small business in Bozeman, Montana called Broken Ground. And I teach people in cold climates how to grow their own food through consultations, education, and design services. So my husband and I live on a 3/4 acre lot. It's a suburban homestead. We have a small greenhouse. We have annual gardens. We have a food forest of fruit trees and berry bushes. And we have chickens and pond and a kind of native pollinator garden. And so one of my goals is to inspire and educate people, especially in a cold climate, on the fact that you can grow a good portion of your own food, even if we have a very short growing season.
Yes, thank you. And tell us a little bit about your background, your early life, and the interests and experiences that led you to this place.
Yeah, so I think, even though my grandmother, I was gifted with her diaries. She kept a diary from 1943 to 1956, and she lived in central Minnesota, so also in a cold climate, and she was raising 6 kids. And my father discovered these diaries when they were going through her stuff. They didn't know that she had kept these, and they were notebooks of everything she did every day with regards to the home. And he had them transcribed. And so it was, canned 12 quarts of tomatoes, harvested so many beans, harvested the potatoes, cleaned all of the kids' clothes. And it's just a litany, a long list of everything that she did. No room there for any kind of emotion, just like a long list of what she did. And it's very tiring to read it in some ways. But also she was doing all of this while there was a war going on. She wrote in her diaries while her husband was working on the railroad. So I have this legacy of growing in my family, and yet I never learned anything from her in terms of growing food. And I think when I talk to my clients and I do workshops, I feel like a lot of people have a legacy of growing food in their families. Obviously, it's 1 or 2 generations past, but we then come to someone like myself or someone else to learn how to grow food. So I have that in my background, and yet I didn't do that growing up. My mom had a garden. We had one until I was about 5 years old, and I would help her in the garden, but didn't have like this strong interest in it. It was there because it was a chore that you needed to do. But I was strongly connected to the natural world, and especially to animals and wild animals. You know, in my teens, I read Diane Fossey, Gorillas in the Mist, and books written by Jane Goodall, and was very inspired and also very angry about people putting profit over wildlife habitat and making decisions that impacted our natural world. And that led me to study environmental science in college. And then I kind of went the human rights and social justice realm and became an activist for several years, and quickly got burned out of being against someone or something and always saying everything that we were doing wrong, and started to look for positive solutions. Like, what do we do as humans that's positive in the world? And that's when I ran across this whole concept of permaculture and got really excited about the idea, and then started my studies, took a permaculture design course, and then I went on to do more advanced studies in permaculture, and then started my business in 2011. So it came from a place of, being in this kind of negative space and looking for ways, and okay, how can humans positively impact the planet? How can we constantly elevate those examples in our world rather than reminding people of everything that humans have done wrong? And I feel like a lot of friends that I know who were also in activism went into growing food. It's this way of kind of being like, look, like as a community, we can build community, we can grow food, but we can reduce our carbon footprint. There's so many positive things that come out of it.
And can you say again, if you haven't already, you got to this place. So how long have you been here doing the suburban homesteading in this mindset?
In Bozeman.
Yeah.
In Bozeman, I started my business in 2011. I'd had gardens at rentals before that. I started my business before owning land. And then we purchased our suburban home with the yard in 2013. And so this will be the 11th season growing on this particular site.
That's a very similar timeline to our being out here on this little farm. Purchased it in 2012 and got out here full time in 2013. It's amazing how when you're first starting and you plant those trees or whatever, and you think it's going to be so long before I see anything. And then all of a sudden, here comes the fruit and here come the berries. And that leads me into my next question. I wanted to talk to you about the idea of permaculture. And how do you think and talk and teach about permaculture? I know it's something specific, but yet it has a very broad use. What's your take on permaculture in your practice?
I know they do say for as many practitioners as there are out there are that many definitions. It's a design approach for sustainable living and land use that's rooted in the observation of natural systems, or it's, designing for human habitation and ecosystem health. It's how can we mimic natural systems in the way that we design our yards, our gardens, our neighborhoods, our communities, and our lives. So it is, a lot of people get mixed up between permaculture techniques like an herb spiral and the whole concept of permaculture, which is a design framework, and it's kind of a philosophy of living based in ethics of earth care, people care, and sharing the surplus, and basic principles through which you look at your site. How can I capture and store energy? How can I obtain a yield on my site? How do I self-regulate and accept feedback on what the natural world is showing me? How do I observe and interact with the site? How do I produce no waste? So a lot of the things that in your slow living challenge, some of that's the same. Permaculture is kind of like a catch-all oftentimes for a lot of different things that we're doing. I also like to see it as a toolbox. It's a toolbox, and depending on the climate that you're in, the culture that you're in, whether you have slope on your property, who your neighbors are, you take out different tools in your toolbox. But those tools are gray water systems and perennial production and annual gardens and, passive solar design and regenerative agriculture. All of those are different tools that we use, but we don't use them all at once because that would be a hot mess. We use them all at once.
Yeah.
So you just have to, and what it encourages you to do is that slow living, is that observe and interact with your space, really know your place, really know your climate, really know the context that you're in, and take time to understand the growing conditions.
Absolutely. And, people might approach the concept or practice of permaculture and maybe be a bit intimidated because, you don't have this design certificate or, you haven't read all the books or all that. But I love talking to people like you who practice it and teach it in terms of just really begins with your relationship with your place, just like what you said. And for me, the very most fundamental aspect or piece of permaculture that always saves me from being overwhelmed with all those little parts you just described is we're going to approach this space, this land, this place with the mindset of working with nature and the patterns of the earth instead of fighting against it. And I certainly came out of a gardening culture. It was, the big battle. And I have learned to back off of that quite a bit in my own space and practice of growing things.
Yeah.
I don't know, call it gardening, call it farming, call it horticulture. I don't know, whatever. It's just all about your mindset and your approach to making things grow. Or let's say helping things grow.
Definitely. One of my favorite definitions is, I think it's from Starhawk, and it's the art of creating beneficial relationships. And so it's not only creating beneficial relationships between plants, say, for example, using maybe companion planting or planting a pollinator garden next to your annual garden so that it's more of an ecosystem, but it's also beneficial relationships between people and plants. And so I always view the garden as the great connector, where I grow things, and some of my friends who are herbalists, I gift them the elderberries and they make elderberry syrup and they gift that back to me. Or I have volunteers that come into the garden and help me and they take away fresh food. And that whole idea of creating beneficial relationships between plants and animals and people. And that's what we need to cultivate more, pardon the pun, we need to cultivate more in our lives.
I love what you said. The garden is the great connector. That is really beautiful. And that idea of people sharing skills, it sort of encourages that sharing economy. That's sort of a step back from the capitalistic system where we can trade things and benefit each other and help keep each other fed and well and supported without money in a garden.
I'm curious, Kareen, over the past, so I guess it's more than a decade that you've been immersed in this work, and I can speak from our own experience. Well, I would say less mine personally and more just observing my mom's work with this at her little homestead, how she'll read a book or we'll interview someone and it'll kind of not totally change, but just transform her way of thinking and her way of doing things and her way of planting. And certainly myself too, the way that I'm eating and the projects that I want to tackle. So what have been some of those big influences on you that have really either changed the course of how you're doing things or just augmented, or I don't know, maybe even more interestingly, have you totally, done a 180 on anything over the past decade?
I love that question, Emma.
Wow. Yeah, that's a big question, Emma. Well, definitely what got me onto permaculture was Vandana Shiva's work. I had gone and studied at her organic farm in Dehradun. So I think that kind of got me into issues around food justice, but also issues around seed saving and seed diversity and augmenting diversity. Use and value diversity is another permaculture principle. So I think her work initially inspired me. I think along the way, Toby Hemingway's Gaia's Garden is a really good home scale permaculture starting book for folks. And then I think reading Robin Wall Kimmerer's Braiding Sweetgrass, I'm sure a lot of your audience has maybe run across that book, or at least Robin Wall Kimmerer. So I think that shifted my perspective a little bit. I think just in terms of permaculture was a design framework, but a lot of the techniques and strategies that we see were innovated in part by Indigenous people, right? So bringing back that Indigenous voice, and also lots of permaculture now is shifting around. There are, say, a certain amount of principles in permaculture. David Holmgren has 12, say, but they're 1 through 12, but sometimes people are starting with principle 0, which is kind of recognizing and understanding kind of the inherent qualities of a place and the traditional ecological knowledge that might already exist there. Rosemary Morrow's book, she's a big elder in permaculture, especially in Australia. She wrote the Earth User's Guide to Permaculture, and then the Earth Restorer's Guide is the new edition. And I think her work in refugee communities also kind of started to shift my focus around, how can permaculture be applied in marginalized communities, right? And in places where you're not really expecting to be growing gardens, maybe in refugee areas. Those all kind of influence things, but I think definitely Barbara Kingsolver's work too, her Vegetable Animal Miracle, that was super inspiring to me. I read that, I believe, before I started having a garden. And so that was definitely a eye-opening around you could grow a good portion of your own food, and this is what it looks like. I've always loved her work and her way of writing. Those are some of the keys. I think I came into, it's funny that you asked that question, I came into gardening always through a permaculture lens. So there wasn't that shift. And in fact, when I took a master gardener class, that was when I was like, oh, this is like a little bit of a different, like more reductionist way of looking at things, both of which have their place, right? To understand the granular is important as well. But those are some of the big influences, I think, in my life.
So in terms of working with your clients, I noticed on your website, you mentioned something that's a favorite of ours and certainly mine over the last couple of years was helping people to grow food instead of a lawn.
Yes.
And I wondered if you could talk about that a little bit, since that, to me, that's such a huge thing, because if more and more people embrace that idea, that could be really, really transformative to the earth,
yes,
and to us as people. So just want to hear what you have to say about that and how you put that into practice, and maybe some examples of how some of your clients have done that.
Yeah, I think that is one of the primary reasons when people call me up, they're like, I'm tired of just watering a lawn. And especially in the West, where water is scarce. So in Bozeman, Montana, here, we're projected, with the rate at which we're growing, we're projected to run out of water in 2035, which is just around the corner, right? So again, permaculture, knowing your place, with 16, sometimes in Montana, it's even as low as 11 inches of rain a year. Like a lawn is not the appropriate, thing to grow. Maybe where you have, 30 inches of rain, that's totally fine. But in Montana, it isn't. So a lot of people are like, hey, I'm spending all this money just paying for water. Why don't I at least grow something instead, like food for my family? And so that is one way that people are like, I have all this lawn. It's too much. I don't want to water it. I don't want to mow it. And so usually I'm doing site visits and being like, this would be a good place to do this. I'm recommending whether you're kind of ripping out your lawn or you're building a food forest of fruit trees and berry bushes instead of your lawn, or encouraging people to do that. I think, in permaculture, it always gets back to your goals. And I really want to be careful to meet clients where they're at, in terms of their lifestyle and how much time they have. Some of us, like you yourselves, you're dedicated to growing food, so you're going to put in the time and energy. And for others, if they are kind of nested in a 9-to-5 job, we also want to recognize and design something for them that's attainable so that they have some successes. And so, usually I'm like, you can bust the sod, or you can, depending on how big the area is, you may want to get an earth worker in here to scrape the lawn, or you can use the sheet mulching method, cardboard and high nitrogen materials, manure and compost, to build up from your lawn space. So I've done any and all of those things. I think one of the big things here, I converted my entire front lawn into kind of like a native pollinator, often medicinal kind of garden space. So it's also like if people don't have time for a vegetable garden, then pushing them towards, well, how about kind of native wildlife habitat, pollinator habitat that's fairly low maintenance, that doesn't take a lot of water. Right. So I think people get really excited about that. I think that's what we want to do, right? Is in this world of like all of these intractable problems and existential threats, we want to be like, hey, don't think that you can't do something. We want to say, hey, if you start growing a little bit of your own food or, convert half of your lawn into pollinator habitat, that is something, right? And I think Doug Tallamy's book, Nature's Best Hope, that kind of weaves together everyone, saying you can do your little thing over here on your yard, and that's going to contribute to this homegrown national park. And so it makes people feel part of something bigger than just that. Because I think a lot of people out there right now are like, what can I do? Like, what impact can I possibly have? Well, you are having an impact, and you can only really influence what's outside your back door and in your community. Yes, we can vote and we can participate in these larger global things, but where you will get the most feedback, the most immediate feedback, and where you will build your own inner resilience is with the small things that you do every day, where you see and you can receive that impact, or you have your neighbors come over and be like, wow, that's amazing. I love I've seen all these butterflies and bees on the flowers that you planted, or thank you for the zucchini,
Yes.
or I've handed like handfuls of pears over the fence to my neighbor, right? Doesn't that feel good to do that? Those are the ways in which we can feel good about what we're doing. And then at the same time feel like, okay, this is the community building and the connections that we want to have. This is how we want to build our communities.
And to your point about the pollinator gardens and putting in some natives and just sort of letting it return to its natural state, even the smallest little piece of land. The really exciting thing about this is that happens really quickly. The feedback loop on that is just very, very gratifying. And it's not like trying to grow apples on an apple tree and starting with an apple seedling. This is way faster. You're going to see something probably that very season.
Yeah, I encourage my clients to take before and after photos, because I think that people don't realize how quickly you can transform a place.
Yes. Nature really, really, really wants to come back. She's just waiting for us to open the door. And my own real personal example of that is we had this circular driveway with this big patch of grass in the middle that we dutifully mowed all these years. And I guess maybe 3 years ago now, we just said, okay, I've talked to enough people now and read enough books, and I've talked to Mary Reynolds and read Doug Tallamy's book and Owen Wormser, Lawns to Meadows. I don't know if you know all these people, but very much influenced my interactions with my own space. And so we covered that grass. We used the mulch method. We did cardboard and mulch on top of that and let that cook a few months and then just started putting in natives. And by the end of that season, things came up and some of them blooming already. And people would drive up and say, what is going on here? Because all of a sudden it was birds and bugs and bees, and just the sounds of it were impressive even. And it had been transformed from just a big old patch of grass. And that leads me to another question. I think grass itself is a big obstacle for people entertaining this idea, and you mentioned, you can get in an earth mover and scrape it off, or you can do the lasagna method or whatever. I prefer the lasagna method, so you can keep the soil intact, but some people might want to go for the other method just to like make it happen faster. Okay, that's okay. But I guess emphasizing to people that you can start so small with it. You can do a square yard.
Yeah, that's one of the permaculture principles, like use small and slow solutions, really encouraging people. You don't have to take on 1,000 square foot garden right out of the gate, right? You can do 2 4x8 raised beds, and that's something. Same with like creating and eliminating some of your grass, right? The other thing though that I would say, and this is part of permaculture too, around social systems design, and what I encourage clients to do is have a work party.
Ah,
right? Many hands make light work. And I think that we've forgotten how to do that and how rewarding that can be. Invite over 5 of your girlfriends, cook dinner for them, and we're going to take out part of this lawn. Like, what's more generative than that? And I think that whole approach, one of my clients, she had scraped her front lawn, and then early this spring, she had a planting party and she invited her neighbors and friends, and she had coffee and donuts for everybody, and everyone just got to planting all of the plants. That's so much more fun than trying to do it on your own, feeling kind of a little bit overwhelmed. And it's such a great community building event. And I think that after she did that, she was like, oh my God, that was so much fun. Another client of mine earlier this season, she's like, I feel all alone. And then over the course, she invited people over because they needed to take down, she just moved to the site. They needed to take down all of this fencing, and 15 people showed up. And everyone had so much fun. And I think it's reminding people, one, people want to connect to the soil, to the earth. They want to connect to people. They want to be outside, and they want to come together through food. It's like reminding people of experiences that they didn't know they needed, but then they walk away from that and they're like, wow, that was fun. I did a bunch of physical labor, but actually it was super fun.
It's so satisfying and like instant gratification in a way that I think we don't have a ton of that anymore. I would say the closest thing is like, little dopamine hits from the internet, whatever that looks like for you. There's nothing like the dopamine from sitting down after moving your body and like moving dirt around. It's so satisfying.
Yeah, I think that's the thing. Sometimes I tell clients, it's like, well, maybe if you want to do an earth worker and remove the grass, great. If you have the finances and the time. Planting parties are super fun because people love planting things. But, it doesn't matter. I run a program called the Resilient Homestead Program, and we did a pond building potluck for one of my clients this past season. And so I think it was probably 10 or 12 of us showed up. We all brought a dish to share, and we helped remove a bunch of the grass and start digging the pond. And then later on, these clients followed up with photos of the pond with the water flowing. And it's like, yeah, we had a hand in that experience. But people talk about the drudgery, but people don't mind the drudgery when it's done in community. And I always remind my clients, like, agriculture was never meant to be a solitary act. This was meant to be done in community. We've forgotten that because we've been socialized in our individualistic culture to go it alone. If you're not successful, then you're a failure. And that's such an unfortunate approach because no, you're not meant to like grow all of the food for your family alone. That's not how it was done. That's not how Indigenous people did it. That's not how our ancestors did it either. We did stuff in community and we helped out. And what I found too, like I've had work parties and weeding parties. This is an example. I brought together a group of permaculture women in the community where they were taking this course that I was a faculty member of, and we would have these work parties. So you bring together women for 2 hours. You host, whoever hosts it makes a dinner for everyone. 5 women for 2 hours. You get 10 hours of weeding done. Like, when else are you going to get 10 hours of weeding done in one night? And in fact, as women, like, you're looking for something to do that's kind of tedious because you just want to talk to one another, right? So you don't want it to be like super focused work. You want it to be something that doesn't take a lot of your mental energy, so you can spend mental energy catching up on work and relationship and what's going on in the community and all of that good stuff. So it's just, again, another generative thing to do where you're also getting work done.
Such a fantastic reminder. And I just love the way you framed this. It's taking me back a few seasons in my neighborhood. I live in a farming community, and a lot of us around here have gardens. And we did this. We took turns going to each other's gardens and spending a couple hours doing whatever needed to be done, mostly weeding. And everybody would bring food, and it would be a potluck afterwards. And like you said, nothing is more satisfying than being working outside, having that time just to chat with each other and catch up and just be together. And it's such a rewarding experience. And what you said about it, we're not meant to do this alone. It sort of gets back to this idea about your lawn being kind of a showpiece. And so you're like a solitary artist with your garden or with your lawn, and you're working on this creation that in a way it sort of is yours, and it shows your skills and it shows your artistry and it shows how good you are at growing things, and that's okay. And we all love our lovely gardens, but when you bring in that element like that's a little bit isolating, it's too hard, we get overwhelmed, we get frustrated, bring the community aspect into it and it completely transforms that. We stop being so worried about how our garden looks or performs on an individual basis and just use it as a vehicle for interacting with your community. I love that so much. And it inspires me that this season I'm going to reach back out to my farmer/gardening friends and say, let's do that again. I don't know how we got away from it. I guess COVID,
Yeah, it sort of abruptly stopped. I have a memory of that. It was so fun though. And you're so right about the thing about like multiplying the hours. It's crazy. 5 people for 2 hours being 10 hours of work. I don't know, maybe not, but to me, it might feel a little at first like I'm going to really like ask my friends to come over and like do basically housework or whatever. You'd be surprised. Like think about, would you do that for a friend? Like, sure. So I think people are like way more willing to do this than it might feel like weird to ask, but it's actually awesome.
It's interesting. I teach this too with my students. It used to be that if you liked your neighbors, you would ask for favors and go over and visit them. And now it's like, if you like your neighbors, you leave them alone. I think it is like we're needing to shift back to a culture of interrelationship. And you're totally right. Like we think, oh no, they're not going to want to do this. But then if your friend asked you, you'd be like, of course I'll do that. And it means like a meal and I can hang out with you. Yeah. And so I think you're right. I think COVID interrupted that. But even before COVID, we were kind of retreating into our own spaces because of digital stuff. People are going to be listening to this on digital media. And some of that's really great. But then we have to remind ourselves that like in-person experiences is what we crave as humans. And so why not do that, but also grow food in the process, build community and grow food.
Oh, yes. And let go of the idea of our spaces as a showplace. I would love to hear you talk about weeds.
Yeah, I love that you bring that up because I do think that is an edge for permaculture sites where you don't want things to look, in order for this to be accessible to more people, let's not make our yards look like a hot mess with a bunch of cardboard and mulch everywhere, right? So I think that there is an invitation, and I've seen some beautiful permaculture spaces. But on the other hand, I also think that it is an invitation to more wildness. So what happens for us, we live in the suburbs and I walk around this new subdivision behind us and I feel like everyone's trying to rein in nature. They're trying to put it in boxes. They're trying to put it in like concrete edging or whatever. They're trying to control wildness in a way. Whereas in my food forest, it's wild, like all sorts of things are going on there. In that sense, I think a little bit of wildness, we know that ecologically, that's a good thing to leave, sticks and branches on the ground so that becomes habitat. But there's a way to do it that looks nicer or that's more artful or more aesthetically pleasing. But I do think that we need to invite people to more wildness on the one hand, but also for permaculture as a field, we also need to make it accessible to people. So there's, I think, a happy medium. As to weeds, yeah, I mean, obviously there are so many weeds out there that are very beneficial. I'm not a permaculture purist of like every weed is amazing and la la la, right? Like I do think that especially again, we need to know our place and the culture in the context. So in Montana, there's a big ranching and farming community, right? So this whole like noxious weeds thing is a big thing. So I'm not going to suddenly have everyone planting St. John's wort everywhere when it's like known as a noxious weed in this climate and in this context. So I think it is, again, observing your place, knowing your place, and acting accordingly. Are there weeds that are beneficial? Yes. Do they serve a purpose? Absolutely. But can we be architects of creating beautiful, wild spaces that are also accessible and that might not make our neighbors angry? Like everything in the natural, like it's all a balance, right? Like finding that ecological balance, but also finding that social balance. And so, you might talk to other permaculture practitioners that are like, whatever goes, whatever grows, goes, right? But I'm a little bit more, because of the culture and the context that I'm in here in Montana, I'm a little bit more measured in that way.
Yes, and in my experience, there are invasives that really, really should go. They really need to go so that the natural ecosystem can be restored. And that's a whole rabbit hole.
I have a related question, and it's in my neighborhood in particular, I live in the city, so I do have a little bit of green space, but it's limited. And there's a lot of kids around. For instance, we share a tiny little green space with our neighbor. And I've gone through phases of wanting to just there's grass. It's like, I don't know, 10 square feet or something. I've gone through phases where I've wanted to totally replace the grass with just natives and grasses and whatever wants to grow there. But it's kind of sad, but it really is like for our neighbor who has like a 5 and a 6-year-old, like sometimes in the summer, it's the only place to like kick a soccer ball around. So I do wonder for your clients with kids and the idea of I think we're so attached to a lawn for many reasons, but I see the like kids playing outside on the lawn thing as like super valid, and it's harder to play soccer on a beautifully permacultured thing. So what have you dealt with that, and what do you advise your clients there?
It's hard to play soccer in a food forest.
Yeah.
So I think lawns do have their place. And I think I do, when I'm with clients or say it's a young couple, I'm like, are you planning on having kids? I'm like, that might be a personal question, but that is kind of informs the design of this place. And I think a little bit of lawn is fine, right? I think we need to reinvent what that looks like. You look at anywhere America suburb and, the vast majority of that yard is lawn. But permaculture, there's a principle, integrate, don't segregate. And so a lot of it in the suburbs, typically it's like lawn, and maybe there's a flower garden, and maybe you do have like a vegetable garden over here, and then like everybody has their one evergreen tree that they have to have on their front yard as dictated by the homeowners association or whatever. And I think the invitation is, you might have some lawn, but is that connected to the garden where the children also play? Or is it connected to the food forest where they run through the food forest? And then they're also kicking a soccer ball in the lawn. So integrating yards in such a way where all of those spaces are spaces where children can play, acknowledging that, a lawn does make sense. And in the West, then you choose drought tolerant native varieties, so that the kids, or even if they are Kentucky bluegrass, you've shrunk the lawn to a size where you're not using as much water, or you're using, in town here, we have a company called Organic Lawn where they put compost teas and stuff on the lawn. So you're improving the soil so that it doesn't take as much water. And so all of those different things. But I think that is, meeting the client where they're at. Of course, your neighbors want to have a place for their kids to play, especially in an urban context, right? And then yards and gardens are dynamic systems. As those children get older and they're like no longer using that space as much, maybe that's when you convert it into a perennial pollinator garden or vegetable garden or fruit trees or whatever. But knowing that your site is a dynamic system that evolves with you and evolves with your life, but not totally kicking the lawn idea to the curb, because that's especially important when you have small children, for sure.
And especially to educate people that you don't have to use a ton of toxic chemicals to have a lawn. There are ways to have areas, play areas, open areas that aren't poisonous.
Yeah. and diversified. So one of the women who I'm on the faculty of the Green Path Herb School, and Elaine Sheff, who's one of the founders of the Green Path Herb School, she encourages people to have an herbal lawn. So you not only have, your grasses, but you can have yarrow in there, and the yarrow will just grow. It will flower at this small height, like at an inch or two, if it keeps on getting mowed. Or you have self-heal in there, or you have plantain. Like, all of those are medicinal plants. But to encourage people, it doesn't have to be all uniform. You can have an herbal lawn that has both grass and all of these other plants that might also be beneficial. So there are various different ways to do it.
Which is delightful, because then you get a lot of fragrance. Yeah. Sometimes you get color. And I think people are conditioned to looking at that stuff in their lawn and thinking it's weeds. And they want to, like the classic example of that is dandelions. The poor little dandelion has been the most vilified plant probably in the world. And it's also the most friendly and human and medicinal and nourishing and beautiful and pollinating and all of these wonderful things. And why do we just go after it? It reminds me of on maybe a social media thread or a community group or something, and people are in there, talking about, how their weeds are a problem, and they'll, something will come up like ground ivy or something like that. And all of this kind of hostility and hatred comes out, like, oh, I hate this plant, and it's just like, whoa, where is all this coming from? How can we be so angry about these things? It reminds me, I mentioned Mary Reynolds a few minutes ago. Are you familiar with Mary Reynolds?
Her name sounds familiar. Remind me who?
She calls herself a reformed landscape designer. And she recently wrote a book called We Are the Ark.
Yes. Okay. That's where, yes. I thought that's what, yes, I do know her. Yes.
The ark being acts of regenerative kindness. And she says we need to become guardians, not gardeners. And that the old model of trying to shape nature for our aesthetic satisfaction needs to go away, and we need to work in cooperation with the earth. All these things we've been talking about, and especially you're reminded of when you're talking about in your suburb and you're walking around and you see all these methods and these borders and these things that keep the weeds out and make things look clean. And Mary Reynolds says that the ways that we try to control nature reflects the way that we've treated women for centuries, which I think is a fascinating idea.
Absolutely.
And so this anger about weeds and things that are invading there, like, that's not the way we want it to look. Mm-hmm. So I just think this is a slow transformation in approach and relationship. And, we just sort of need to talk about and point these things out. And they might want their yard to look like that. And that's okay. Mm-hmm. It's just, I think, interesting to kind of open it up and kind of be aware of where those feelings come from and what is the necessity of that? Why is that a goal for us? As we've been talking about, we want to create more connectivity. We want to create more community. We feel like this is the solution to a lot of our problems right now. How can we sort of open up to more of these concepts in our spaces and in our lives? It's all sort of interlinked. And that also reminds me of just this morning, I was reading an article in Acres Magazine. Are you familiar with Acres Magazine?
Yeah.
You probably saw this article where the guy was writing about quackgrass.
Mm-hmm.
And, if there's ever, probably maybe even more than the dandelion, a vilified weed, it must be quackgrass. It's really, really invasive and hard to get out. And, if you've got quackgrass, forget it. You're never, this is the idea. But he analyzed it for the minerals. He found it to be, it's got all these wonderful restorative properties. So he took it and he fermented it, and he tells you in the article how to ferment wheat to get the beneficial compounds out of them. And now he uses quackgrass as a means of restoring the soil.
Right. That makes me think about, in permaculture, there's an expression, the problem is the solution. And so Bill Mollison, who's one of the co-originators, said, as an example, it's not that you have too many slugs in your garden, it's that you don't have enough ducks. Inherent in the problem that you see is the solution. I like to say it's not that we have too many lawns in suburbia, it's that we don't have enough gardens. right? So that there is a way to find the solution. So it's not that you don't have too much quiet grass, it's that that's an opportunity to create more fertility. Or, with say you have a bunch of thistle and dandelion in your yard, you're adding that to a 5-gallon bucket and making a weed tea to fertilize your garden, right? So always looking at, again, that's that harmonizing with the pattern, like you said at the beginning, Mary, around, what permaculture is, harmonizing with the pattern and finding a way to work with it rather than battle against it. And I think those are the constant reminders that we have to have as gardeners or guardians of land and landscapes, but also maybe in our lives in general, right? In terms of, the problems or that we have in our lives, how can we turn those into solutions? And I think there's a guy in LA called Farmer Rishi, and he likes to say, rather than reducing our carbon footprint, how are we increasing our regenerative footprint? Knowing that, yes, we as humans have done horrible things on this planet and to our planet, but we can also do beautiful things, and we can create community, and we can change ecosystems and create ecosystems. So how can we turn this problem of the climate crisis into a solution? We often look at agriculture as the problem. Agriculture can be the solution with regenerative agriculture, with soil building, all of these different ways, with agroforestry practices, with planting trees. And so really marching people towards that. I feel like a lot of times one of my main jobs is to keep people hopeful about the future.
Oh, yes. And this takes us back to the beginning of the conversation when you said you experienced such burnout in the nonprofit world, always screaming about all the bad things that we're doing. And it gets exhausting. It's depleting. And I think we need to recognize that here, we are in the Anthropocene, which means that humans are having an impact on the natural world. That does not have to be all bad. We can make intentional moves to regenerate, restore, bring back, allow, open that door that Mother Nature's just there waiting for us. It's just like sticking in a few natives and watch it come back. It's really marvelous and wondrous, I will say. So just kind of like backing off a little bit from we had an old expression we used to say, the ain't it awful mentality of going around saying we're in such a terrible state. Yeah. But we can do such wonderful things.
It would be interesting. I often find, what if we woke up every morning instead of hearing, what's going on in the news, which is usually bad news these days, is, if we had these examples, these constant examples of what people are doing in their communities to grow food or to build community or to help people out. And I think that would also change our psyche significantly.
Oh, I think it would. And there are a lot of people doing that. Sailors for Sustainability that we interviewed, they have spent 7 years sailing around the world.
Wow.
And they'll go to a country where a community is doing something like this and go on land and meet them and hang out with them and see what they're doing and record it and write about it. And then they get back in their sailboat and they go somewhere else.
Yeah.
They've been doing this for 7 years.
That's awesome.
Yeah, isn't that great?
I'll have to listen to that episode. I'll have to look for that episode and listen to it.
We have 2 interviews with people from this wonderful organization called EcoCiv. Their whole thing is to imagine an ecological civilization where all living beings are able to thrive and the environment is respected and human rights and social justice and environmental justice and all these wonderful things is actually appreciated and in play. And they do the same thing. They go around and highlight projects all around the world where people are actually moving towards these goals. So there are people doing this sort of thing. So there is hope. There's a tremendous amount of hope. And that's why we're here on The Good Dirt.
Yeah. I mean, I think that is the advantage of all these podcasts out there, is that they're telling the stories of everyday people doing good work in their communities. And we need reminders of that. And that is what the digital age has allowed people to do, is have a platform without a lot of gatekeeping to be able to tell stories, which I think is fabulous. And the more the better, and the more community we create, the better. I think last night, through my business, one of the missions of my business is community building. So of course I do designs for clients. I teach people, I do consultations, but one of my fair share pieces of the permaculture ethic is that every couple months or every 3 months, sometimes during the growing season, it'll be monthly, I hold a potluck in the community. And so again, it's people coming together through food. You know that those potlucks are going to have delicious food because it's mostly gardeners that are coming together. And it's just an opportunity for people to connect. And we had one last night, like probably about 30 people showed up. Everyone starts connecting with their community and they get to know other people. And in that potluck, I do what I learned at a permaculture women's conference years ago, and that's called offers and asks. So if you have something to offer the community, you put it out to the community. If you need something from the community, you ask. And the whole idea is that whole barter and exchange, to revive the barter and exchange and to see whether we don't always have to pay money for things within our community. Do you have plants? I need seedlings for the growing season. Oh, this person over there has seedlings, or I need some good dirt. And oh, this person over here has that. Or I want perennial plants. Oh, well, I'm going to be dividing my plants in the spring, so come on by. Again, opportunity for connection. And it's been really fascinating. And it doesn't have to be related to the garden. It can be anything. And it's been fascinating, the connections that have been formed that way. It fills my cup to host these events, but I think it also, people walk away from there and thank me afterwards of like, thanks for bringing community together. Because the more we can weave the web and be connected to one another, the more we feel that sense of community, and you feel like you're part of something bigger than just yourself.
That's fantastic. And it's some time back, we actually interviewed a farmer in Virginia that did the same thing. He organized potlucks amongst the growers in the area, and they were doing it for years and years. They get together every month and do exactly that. Just connect.
For an offer and ask. That's a good place to start from, just to invite that.
Yes, and very inspiring.
It's again gets back to that agriculture wasn't meant to be a solitary act, in that, you're also getting a cross fertilization of ideas of like, oh, when are you starting your seeds, or like what varieties work well for you, right? So it's kind of, I invite people sometimes to be like, if you don't feel like you have a community and you feel like that's in your character to create it, like cultivate it. Or because we're no longer doing this agriculture thing in tribes or in communities, we need to create it ourselves. Right? So what does that look like in your life? What's attainable for you? Maybe it's that planting season's super busy and harvest season is super busy. Maybe in between, people are recreating, taking vacations, whatever. But if you can stack your life and design your life where you have support on both ends, then that's the art of design, right? And the functionality of design is to be able to do that. And in permaculture, it's everything has multiple functions, right? That planting party is an opportunity to connect with your friends, is an opportunity to exchange ideas about growing, is an opportunity to exchange seedlings, that whole thing. And then it's an opportunity to have a meal together. So that whole experience serves multiple functions. It's not just one experience. It accomplishes multiple things.
That's so great. Thank you for bringing that today. That's such a helpful and inspiring takeaway, I think, from this conversation, whether or not you are doing a permaculture garden in your garden.
Totally.
Anybody can have a potluck.
Yeah.
It's a pretty accessible thing to do.
Yeah.
Right.
Absolutely.
So what does slow living mean to you?
Yeah. What popped into my head the other day was the philosopher Lao Tzu, who said, nature never hurries, but everything is accomplished. I oftentimes, growing in a cold climate, the growing season is really crazy. You hit the ground running and you have a very short growing season to grow. And I think I always remind myself of that quote of, slow living to me is reconnecting to the natural world. That whole experience reminds us that nature never hurries, yet everything is accomplished. And so whether that means that you're taking more time to observe, or whether that means that you're taking time to tend to your vegetable seedlings early in the season, or that moment in the garden where, yes, you have to harvest this thing, but you notice a bumblebee that's on the comfrey flower. We almost have to just intentionally take those little moments of reminders to stop and slow down and just be in the moment. So I think it is just that reminder of the natural world has so much to teach us if we slow down and listen.
Yes.
I love that. I've never thought about nature not hurrying, but it's so true.
Yeah, that's a wonderful quote. Just curious, what is your growing season in Montana?
Great question, Mary. So the length of our growing season is usually about 110 days or so. Do season extension on both ends typically, but we don't put seeds in the ground outside until the end of April, beginning of May. And then we can get a frost as early as mid-September. Usually you're constantly having to be on your toes to make sure that you don't lose stuff. And then we got hail in there in June, July. It is a very challenging growing season. And yet I grow 6 months of fresh fruit a year, and I'm still eating frozen fruit from our fruit trees. And so I think it is encouraging people also to put in more perennial plantings in addition to all the annual plants, but to have those fruit trees and that rhubarb and those currants and gooseberries and raspberries and all of those things also going while you're scrambling maybe in your annual garden.
So it can be done, folks, even if you live somewhere cold. And Kareen is here to teach you how. Did your growing zone get adjusted? Ours just did.
It did, though I'm a little bit skeptical.
Really?
Well, I think what the hardiness zone doesn't account for, especially here in our climate, are the extreme temperatures. So even though ours has been bumped up to 5 when it was 4B before, so, okay, maybe I can grow peaches. We got like minus 40 degrees a month ago. Is that going to account for those extremely wild, it was minus 40 degrees. And then literally 4 days later, it was 40 degrees. So I think that's where I'm not sure now whether we can really use yes, we can use the hardiness zone as a general guide, but I don't feel confident all of a sudden saying, okay, I can now grow peaches and nectarines in our climate and not think that during the wintertime with some extreme temperature weirdness that's going on, that I'm not going to lose those plants. So I don't know.
Yeah, that's interesting that you would pick peaches as the example of that, because peaches love to grow here. They'll come up as volunteers. They'll be all over the place. But even so, the chances of actually getting peaches, it's probably, I don't know, from my experience from here, just 10 years of gardening, I want to say something like 60%, because one cold night in April or May and you're done. And even our wonderful CSA that, they full diet CSA, we get everything from them. It's really a toss up whether or not we're going to have peaches any given year because of these random cold temperatures. They'll just wipe it out. Just like you said, it's super interesting. And yeah, so we got bumped up from 7A to 7B. But 12 years ago, when we first moved here, it was 6B. And it was also, according to the USDA website, was 5 degrees colder, which is a lot.
Yes.
Average. Yeah. And so now, having been here a decade plus, I'm really seeing things that are different. So again, we could go to a dark place on that and get all scared and stuff. Or we could just say, okay, the earth is going through changes. And just as we were saying, we are humans. We can have a positive impact here. So yeah, let's go.
And that's what I tell my clients too, is that's where kind of resilience and stacking your site with multiple things, especially if you have perennial systems. One year you might not have peaches, but you might have a ton of cherries. The more diversity that you stack onto your site, the more likelihood that you are going to have something that's going to give you fruit and something that's going to give you veg, right? Don't just grow one type of tomato, grow 5 types of tomatoes so that some of them will yield. And I think that's reminding people you may not get a yield from everything every year. That's why you need diversity on your site. And especially with the temperature ranges. I lost all of my cherries in June one year because of a late frost, but I had raspberries and I had currants and I had gooseberries, right? So you're still, and then we had pears. So you're still having that ability to produce your food. And that's where we just need to get people into that mindset of like, stack your site with diversity, understand that not everything is going to work every year. And I often tell clients, if you're not failing as a gardener every year, then you're just not trying hard enough. Like something's going to go wrong inevitably.
That's great. That's really, really great.
Yeah.
I'm going to remember that.
We don't like failing as adults, right? We don't like to be beginners at anything as adults, which is something that people are interested in gardening, but they also feel like, oh my gosh, I might fail. And I can't believe I have to learn this. This seems like a stupid question. Well, no, it's not. Unlike before, where we learned from our mother or our grandmother, we're not doing that anymore. So of course you're a beginner at this because it wasn't passed down, and that's fine. You're learning now, but also know that you're going to fail. And that if you've been gardening for 30 years, you've only grown tomatoes 30 times. That's not a lot.
So true.
Yeah.
Related to that, what does the good dirt mean to you?
Yeah. I think for me, the good dirt is like living a meaningful life connected to soil, connected to plants, and connected to what we've been talking about this whole time, connected to community. I think all of those parts make for a whole person.
This has been so fun. What do you want people to most understand about the work that you do?
Well, I think it comes back to the theme of growing community as much as you're growing food. I think that cultivating community where you live, I'd encourage people to do that in whatever way they think they can. Another message, obviously, would be that if you are in a cold climate, like Mary was saying before, you can grow a good portion of your own food. Don't be intimidated by that. And of course, if people are interested, my website is brokengroundpermaculture.com. You can follow me on Instagram at brokengroundmt. I also have a YouTube channel that's Broken Ground. So you can see, I give tours of my gardens. I do all sorts of different videos about growing. And then I do run a resilient homestead program every year. So for those who are interested in learning about permaculture, but also interested in having someone take you through the site planning process, if you have a new site or you're new to the area or you have a yard or garden, I take students through kind of content related to permaculture and creating food forests and capturing water and growing medicinal plants, all of that, while at the same time guiding you through a site planning process of your own site. So, and that's online. I do that from November through February every year. So if people are interested in that, they can check that out on my website as well.
Wow. So it's no matter where they are, what zone they're in, you can still help. Wow. Cool.
It's super exciting. I just closed out my cohort just a couple days ago. So yeah, we spend 4 months together online. We meet once every 2 weeks in the evening, and it's just a fun way to have some accountability. Because there's a lot of people out there who want to do their own site plan, but they never really get to it. So it's a little bit of structure and accountability around that, while at the same time learning what you need to know in terms of having your own homestead.
Cool.
Oh, wow. This has been a fantastic conversation. I've just really loved it. And thank you so much for your time and joining us today.
Yes, likewise. Thank you so much for having me. And thank you for all you do with getting the word out with this podcast. So I really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you. We appreciate that.
We appreciate that so much, and we enjoy doing it.
Thank you for tuning in, calling in, and spreading the good dirt. We love hearing from you. You can reach our listener voicemail at 443-459-1950. That's 443-459-1950. You can find this number in our show notes and in our Instagram profile.
This show is produced by Lady Farmer, a slow living lifestyle community, and the original music is composed and performed by John Kingsley.
For more from Lady Farmer, follow us on Instagram at WeAreLadyFarmer. That's WeAreLadyFarmer. Or join us online at www.ladyfarmer.com. We'll see you next time on The Good Dirt.
Goodbye.